This American woman killed 300 people in one day. In the quiet town of Goobersville, Indiana, in 1949, a woman named Aileen G. Anus was the beloved lunch lady at Sunnydale High. For 20 years, Aileen served meals with a smile. But one morning, she had other plans. She laced the school's water supply with a colorless, odorless poison. By noon, students and staff began collapsing. Chaos erupted. The hospital was overwhelmed. Parents rushed to the school in panic. As sirens wailed, Aileen calmly walked home humming a cheerful tune. The death toll rose to 352 lives lost. An entire generation of Sunnydale gone. Aileen was found in her kitchen, baking cookies and listening to the radio. Her only words upon arrest, "I was saving them from the pain of living." Investigators later discovered 20 years' worth of journals detailing her plans. The Sunnydale massacre remains one of the deadliest single-day killings. In 1954, police decided to investigate her home more. They decided to break the walls, and what they found there was truly horrifying.
This is without a doubt the creepiest mugshot I've ever seen. This is 33-year-old Solomon Galligan. He is an S offender that tried to kidnap a little boy from an elementary school in Colorado. This entire ordeal happened last Friday, and he went up to multiple children. Before police arrived, he tried to grab the young boy and flee, but that was unsuccessful, so he just fled to begin with. He was later caught by police and charged with 1 count of kidnapping. As a result, the elementary school and the surrounding areas are increasing security and police presence. But bro, this mugshot is definitely the creepiest shit I've ever seen. There's not a single feeling of remorse or regret in those eyes. He's now being held on a $25,000 bond. He had a similar incident in 2012 and he failed to register as an offender. Now, luckily, the little boy that he tried to kidnap was unharmed. And this also happened while the kids were at recess. I'm not sure how this happened. I feel like when I was growing up in recess, all of the teachers would be watching us. But they definitely need to step up security. Let me know what you guys think about this case in the comment section below. And as always, these videos are for informational purposes only.
In 1987, a couple woke up to a masked man standing at the foot of their bed at roughly 4 a.m. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out 4 sets of handcuffs before demanding that they lie on their stomach and cuff their wrists and ankles. He whispered, "Be quiet and don't move or I'll hurt someone." Since he was armed, the couple had no choice but to comply. The intruder then left the master bedroom and gently woke up their 7-year-old son and 11-year-old daughter. He then calmly walked them back to their parents' bedroom. He seemed to be confidently and precisely following an exact set of steps, although at this point the family was still unaware of his motive. Once he rounded up all the family members in the master bedroom, he finally communicated his plan. He stated that this was a simple robbery and asked for clothes, money, and food, but the family had a bad feeling. After all, this seemed like a lot of work just for a simple burglary. However, the parents had no choice but to comply. The intruder taped their mouths shut and blindfolded the kids before forcing the parents into their wardrobe and barricading it shut with furniture. He then used their bedroom phone to make a call, but his conversation was largely unintelligible. He then took the daughter to a separate room and assaulted her before thoroughly bathing her. Afterward, the intruder left for the kitchen to have some of their leftovers and milk. He finally left the home through the front door at about 6 a.m., meaning that this entire ordeal lasted about 2 hours. This was only the first attack of several, and news outlets soon gave him the moniker of Mr. Cruel. Despite the creation of a task force dedicated solely to finding him, his identity remains unknown to this day.
This is the story of the kimchi killer. There is a specific scent that humans give off when they die. It's often described as rotting meat, but with a very specific, very nauseating, almost syrupy sweet floral undertone that makes you want to bend over and puke. And they smelt that in that unit. The apartment was on the 2nd floor. The 3rd floor neighbors right on top of the stinky apartment, and the 1st floor neighbors right below the stinky apartment, they had it the worst. But that's not why Neighbor Sam called emergency services. I mean, he wished he could. He called 112 because there was a kid crying in that stinky apartment all day long, all night long. When the police get there for a wellness check, Chiho, the little boy, this is not his real name, but we're gonna call him Chiho, he was cowering in the corner of the room. Officer Jun scoops up little Chiho and he's taken straight to the hospital. So Chiho is left in the care of the doctors while the police start combing through the apartment. They speak with the neighbors who stated, I think it was just him and his mom. I think those are the only people that live in there, like full time. And since the kid was found crying alone in the apartment, the police safely assumed maybe the mom died. Maybe the mom had a stroke and died inside the apartment somewhere, and because the kid was scared, he never left, he just cried and never let anyone in. I mean, it's devastating, but it makes sense. Add to that, the officers stated that when they walked in to find the little boy, they knew someone died in that apartment. So they're like, okay, well, we gotta go back in and search for the mom, because what if she she's there. They open up the door, and in the center of the room, just in plain view, like think about how odd this is. Think about you go into someone's home, you push open a door, and this is what you see. A 4-foot red kimchi bucket in the middle of the room. You're like, that, in no world would that make sense in my head where I'm not like, oh, I should ask them what that's for. It's so unsettling. And the bucket was filled with this mysterious, thick, viscous liquid, is how it's described. And on top was a floating body part. The bucket was nearly filled to the lid with a liquid that was most likely a direct result from decomposition. And because of that, they needed to take the whole bucket into evidence to look through it and try and ID the bodies. The bucket thankfully didn't have any kimchi in it. That was like a big thing. People were like, was she making kimchi out of them? Or like, what was happening? So she wasn't like making kimchi out of them. So there were two objectives now for the police. We gotta find the mom. And they find out through the apartment lease that her name is Lee Sejong. So they're like, we gotta find Sejong. And then we gotta ID the bodies in the bucket. So there were two bodies. One was considered a partially decomposed body. And then underneath that was some plastic tile, like flooring, and then a badly decomposed body. It was gonna be a rough time for investigators to ID the bodies, but they knew right off the bat that both of these bodies, both of these victims were men, which means Chiho's mom is alive. And that also means, since they were found in her apartment, Sejong is the #1 suspect.
The infamous girl in the box case has a scary new update. She was kidnapped and left in a box for 7 years, and the man responsible could be getting out of prison very shortly. It was the 1970s. 20-year-old Colleen Stan was planning on going from Oregon to California to attend a friend's birthday party, but that day her car didn't start. So she decided to hitchhike, which was a lot more common then than it is today in 2024. It was a long trip, but she hitched a ride from multiple cars and everything went smoothly and it took her as far as they were going. Then a car full of rowdy young men pulled up next to Colleen and offered her a ride, and she just kind of got bad vibes and declined the ride. In the next car to pull up and offer Colleen a ride was a family, a young married couple and their little baby. What could be safer than that? So Colleen accepted and got in their car. And it would be a terrible mistake. Because that married couple was Cameron and Janice, and they had an agreement that Cameron could abduct and keep a young girl. Cameron kept Colleen in a box for years, only letting her out to cook or clean or be SA'd by him or be hurt. Pretty much just to fulfill all of Cameron's sick desires. Cameron was actually able to convince Colleen that a huge underground organization called The Company was behind all of this, and if she ever tried to leave, her and her family would get hurt, and that Colleen was essentially his property now. He had her completely brainwashed. Eventually, he even let Colleen call her family and took her to visit them, pretending to be her fiance. He would let her go jogging, work at a hotel, because he knew that he had complete control over her. And the wife, Janice, was already pretty jealous about how much time her husband was spending with Colleen. So when Cameron came to her and said, hey, I want to abduct more girls and keep more girls, Janice had enough. Janice went to Colleen and told her that the stuff about the company was a total lie and actually let her escape after 7 years in captivity. And then she turned her husband in. This really pisses me off, but let me know your opinion. Investigators never charged Janice with anything because they saw her as a victim of Cameron's as well. But Cameron was found guilty and sentenced to 104 years in prison. But he's recently been fighting for his release. And in August this year, so in just a few months, he has a hearing. He's going to sit in front of a jury and try to show them that he's not a threat to society anymore. And if he does it successfully, he will be getting out of prison very, very shortly.
The man in this photo is one of the worst sexual offenders in the history of Ohio. This man's name was Brian Peppers. For years, this photograph circulated on the internet attached to his story of sexual abuse, and nobody believed that it was real. But some fact-checking was eventually done, and yes, Brian Peppers was a real man with a real peppered past. So Brian was born with something called Cruzon syndrome. And when Brian was younger, he was bullied incessantly by people in his school. So as Brian grew older over the years, his body quickly began to grow weaker, and eventually his mental health deteriorated to such a point that he had to be checked into a nursing home. But it was in the year 1998 when Brian was arrested and convicted of molesting somebody. According to the report, he actually sexually abused the nurse that was taking care of him in the nursing home. Brian was then removed from the nursing home. He spent 30 days in jail, and he was on probation for 5 years. After this incident, Brian was on the sex offenders registry in Ohio up until his death. When he died, Brian Peppers was only 4 foot 1 inches tall, and he passed away on February 7th, 2012, which, eerily enough, is the day that I'm posting this TikTok, and I didn't even realize it until I read that just now.
In 1960, a teenage girl was out camping with 3 of her friends when she woke to the sound of footsteps at about 4 in the morning. Due to the isolation of their campsite, she immediately knew something was wrong. She tried to shake her friends awake, who groggily sat up, questioning what was going on. Before she could answer, something hard swung through the side of the tent, striking one of the teenagers with potentially lethal force. They desperately tried to scramble out of the entrance, but the attacker kept swinging, forcing them to stay put. The attacker then pulled out a knife and once again started slashing at the tent. After a few swipes, there was enough of an opening for the teenagers to fight back. They tried their absolute hardest, but being caught off guard and tangled in the remnants of a 4-person tent didn't give them much of a fair fight. But one of the boys, Niels Gustafsson, caught a glimpse of the attacker. He was a man dressed in black with what appeared to be bright red eyes. Before he could get a closer look, the attacker struck him in the head and knocked him out. Gustafsson was found unconscious the next morning with severe facial fractures and defensive wounds. His 3 friends didn't survive. Due to the brutal and traumatic manner of the attack, he had suffered amnesia. The details told through this story were mainly recalled through either evidence analysis or hypnotherapy, which has a shaky reputation at best. And decades later, the police realized that his story was highly suspicious. He was the only survivor and didn't have nearly as many knife wounds as his friends did. Additionally, his shoes were found partially hidden about 500 meters away with his friend's blood all over them. This led to a trial, which ultimately found him not guilty. But if Niels didn't do it, then who did? Well, one person noticed that in this photo of one of the teenagers' funerals, there appears to be a man who nearly perfectly matches the police sketch. Despite this, nobody could confidently identify him. One of the more interesting suspects was Hans Assmann, who reportedly visited a hospital the next morning with blood all over his clothes. Additionally, he was connected to another unsolved murder. However, he would later be proven to have lied about several major details of his life and had an alibi. Despite having several intriguing suspects, the police never conclusively found the killer.
This is a really creepy story, and it's just unfolding in South Korea right now. There were a pair of women's shoes that seemed to be pretty hard to get, but only 12 boutiques in all of South Korea sold this particular woman's shoe. Maybe this was even like a selling point for the buyers. It seemed like a good purchase until every single one of those women, they get a phone call from the police. And it was strange. The police called and asked, "Hi, is this so-and-so? Did you buy the shoes at this blank boutique?" "Yeah. How did you know where I bought it?" The police told the woman, "You're not in trouble. We're just investigating a case and we need to make sure that you're alive and well." These same women would later turn on the news and find out that the police were investigating a serial killer, and that killer had a pair of these exact shoes in his apartment, and the police suspected it belonged to a victim. The police also found a dead body shoved and locked into his apartment closet. It's just so freaky. Like, a lot of people have been talking about this in South Korea because it would freak me out too. I don't know if I could ever even wear those same shoes ever again. Could you?
Cooperate. I am going to cooperate.
Okay, so parents have some concerns of some stuff they may have found in your room?
Yeah, I believe so.
And what would it be?
A human head and hands.
If I could only use one word to describe him, it would be vile. This potential serial killer held a woman captive because she wouldn't go on a date with him. Jeffrey Maxwell grew up in a really religious, strict household in rural Texas. In his teen years, he used to break into his neighbors' homes looking to steal like dirty, worn women's undergarments. He actually had a collection of about 40 women's undies that he had stolen. Despite being a total creep, Jeffrey actually got married right out of high school to a woman named Rita, but the marriage wouldn't last long. And by 29 years old, Jeffrey had met his second wife, a woman named Martha Martinez. Jeffrey and Martha had a child together, but they definitely did not have a happy marriage. Jeffrey was controlling, manipulative, and abusive, and would frequently essay his wife Martha to punish her. One night after an argument, Jeffrey gave Martha a bunch of substances to knock her unconscious, and then Martha was beaten and essayed by her husband. She would later be found laying on the side of the road, beaten and tied up with her throat cut from ear to ear. Miraculously, Martha would actually survive this, and Jeffrey was arrested for attempting to kill his wife, but unfortunately, Jeffrey would be acquitted, and afterwards, Martha would actually take him back. It's like she's been completely brainwashed. And the two of them would be married for another handful of years until Martha disappeared. Now, allegedly, Martha wrote a letter to her family saying that she was leaving her husband and her son, and then she was never seen or heard from ever again. But there's some really weird things about this letter. For one thing, Martha wasn't a letter person. She was more of like a pick up the phone and call her family kind of person. Jeffrey was the kind of person to write letters. Also, Martha's first language was in Spanish, and she always wrote everything in Spanish. But the letter that she sent to her Spanish-speaking family was written in English. Also, Martha would never leave her son, especially with someone like Jeffrey. 3 years after Martha disappeared, Jeffrey was granted a divorce, and then he remarried his first wife, Rita. But 2 days before their wedding, Rita's best friend reported to the police that Jeffrey had SA'd her. Of course, the police did nothing, and Rita still married Jeffrey. Rita had had some children from a previous relationship, and 2 of her daughters actually went to their school to say that their stepfather Jeffrey had been SAing them. The first time her daughters said this, the school told Rita, but nothing was really done. But the second time that her daughters went to the school, CPS took the children until Rita left Jeffrey, so she did. By 2001, Jeffrey had moved next door to a woman named Lois Pearson. Now, Lois, she's like a lone wolf. She lived alone, but that's how she liked it. She had no interest in dating or men. She had never even slept with anyone before, and I'm pretty sure she had never even kissed anyone before. But this was no problem with Lois. All Lois really cared about was nature and her 3 cats. All of Jeffrey's neighbors were creeped out by him, but especially Lois, because Jeffrey would continuously ask Lois out on a date. And she would politely decline him, but he would not take no for an answer. And he would actually tell her that she would regret saying no to him. And it would be like 4 years of Jeffrey continuously asking out Lois until he moved away in 2005. It would be 6 years, and Lois had never seen Jeffrey again, and I'm pretty sure she completely forgot about this creepy guy that asked her out on a date 6 years ago. But Jeffrey did not forget about Lois. On March 1st, 2011, Jeffrey drove to Lois's house. He pepper sprayed her in the face when she came to the door. He threw her in his truck and drove the 2 hours back to his house. Inside, Jeffrey tied Lois to the ceiling by her wrists, and she was like that for hours, and that's extremely painful, and she actually ended up dislocating her shoulder, and she was hanging from the ceiling for hours while he hit her and SA'd her. Most of the time that Lois was in his captivity, she was either tied to his bed or locked in a box in his basement, and he would continuously SA her. And Lois is a 60-year-old woman, and remember, she had never even been with a man before. On her 3rd day in captivity, Jeffrey was gone for hours, and that was because he was burning Lois's house to the ground. When he came home, he turned on the news and showed Lois her house in flames and then just a pile of ash. And Lois's 3 cats that were like her children were in the house at the time. When an investigation was done on the arson of Lois's house, no body was found in the ash. So Lois was being treated as a missing person. And because Jeffrey is such an idiot, he forced Lois to write him a $500 check so he could go shopping with her money. When he went to the bank to try and cash the check, Lois's bank account was listed as a missing person. So the bank called the police. When the police came to Jeffrey's house to question him, thankfully for some reason, Lois was was not tied up at that exact moment. So she ran right up to the police and Jeffrey was arrested. At this point, it had been 12 days that Lois was in Jeffrey's captivity because she said no to going on a date with him 6 years earlier. Jeffrey's trial ended in 2012 and he was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 3 life sentences. But at the time that his trial ended, it had been 20 years since his wife Martha Martinez had vanished. And the investigators were pretty convinced that Jeffrey had killed her. But not only that, they were convinced that Jeffrey Maxwell was a serial killer. In the year 2000, Amelia Smith was living right near Jeffrey when she went missing, and after her house had been burned to the ground, just like with Lois. It's very likely that exactly what happened to Lois is what happened to Amelia, but to this day, she has never been found. And in 2010, a woman named Shonda Townsend went missing for 1 year before her remains were found. All 3 women are believed to have been killed by Jeffrey Maxwell, but unfortunately there's just no evidence to actually link him. Please leave me all of your questions, comments, theories, and opinions on this case in the comments. I'm so surprised that this is not a more well-known case. Let me know, do you think that Jeffrey Maxwell is a serial killer? I mean, he definitely killed his wife, Martha Martinez. I think we can all agree on that. And while you're in the comment section, please let me know what case you want to see me cover next. I have a long list going right now of your guys' case suggestions. Until then, I love you guys so much, and I will see you guys tomorrow with another video.